So far in our discussion of climate change, we have discussed the idea of the greenhouse effect, that certain gases, CO2 and methane and water vapor and several others, are able to retain heat in the Earth's atmosphere for much longer periods of time, leading to an overall warmer climate. And we've been talking about the source of these gases in terms of direct human emissions. But next I would like to talk about the concept of feedback loops. And I think the easiest way to explain them is to just give you an example. So you all know from our discussion of photosynthesis that plants take carbon dioxide in from the atmosphere, and if there's ample water and sunlight, they're able to take that carbon dioxide and rearrange the atoms to form sugars, which they use to build up their biomass. As the climate becomes hotter and drier in some regions, the likelihood of extreme forest fires increases substantially. And when forest burns, all that carbon dioxide that they sequestered is released back into the atmosphere. The increased level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in turn leads to yet hotter and yet drier conditions, which again increases the risk of forest fires, which then releases more CO2 again and again and again. This is a feedback loop, a sequence of processes which end up enhancing themselves, and we can talk about other feedback loops as well. For example, you may recall that in an earlier video I mentioned that atmospheric gases can be found dissolved inside of the ocean. This is what fish breathe, after all, dissolved oxygen, but there's dissolved carbon dioxide as well. There is a rule in chemistry called Henry's law, which states that as the temperature of a liquid increases, its ability to hold gases decrease. So as the oceans get slowly warmer, the dissolved carbon dioxide found inside will be emitted out into the atmosphere. In addition, a warmer world means more evaporation, and more moisture will just be held in the atmosphere on a regular basis. This means the humidity in many areas will increase, but water vapor is also a greenhouse gas, so having more of it in the atmosphere will lead to yet more warming. Tundra ecosystems are so cold that they have a layer of permanently frozen soil just beneath the surface. The cold temperatures cause there to be very little decomposition, so this means that there's actually quite a bit of undecomposed organic matter in the permafrost. However, as global temperatures increase, a lot of the permafrost is melting, which dramatically changes the structure of this ecosystem, but it also allows that organic matter to rot, and rotting releases CO2 in addition to methane, which is a greenhouse gas 23 times more powerful than CO2. And this once again creates a positive feedback loop. The Earth has a lot of dark surfaces, and when sunlight hits these dark surfaces, it's absorbed and re-radiated out as heat. Like choosing between a white t-shirt and a black t-shirt on a hot summer day, the darker the surface, the more heat is re-radiated and subsequently captured by the atmosphere. However, the Earth's polar ice caps, which are covered in snow and ice, are very bright white and reflective, and a lot of that light that hits the surface ends up bouncing off, reflecting off, and ending up going back into space without ever being converted into heat. The more light that is reflected, the less heat gets captured by the atmosphere. Warming has been highest around the polar regions, and as the Earth has gotten warmer, the amount of snow has decreased, causing the snow belts to end up retreating. And this means that less visible light is reflected, and therefore more is captured as infrared radiation. It should come as no surprise at this point that more heat means more snow melt, means less reflected light, means another warmer atmosphere, and we have another feedback loop. Some of the water that comes from melting glaciers on land ends up dumped into the ocean and contributing to sea level rise. Another factor in sea level rise is that as liquids get warmer and warmer, they tend to expand, which means that the seawater is going to end up inundating coastal areas, and we'll see more frequent flooding. Already, many island villages are becoming flooded during high tide, and the villagers have started moving inland. Some coastal cities have had to invest in large infrastructure changes in order to either raise the streets, pump out excess water, or both. Of course, it is against environmental law to do a global warming presentation without mentioning polar bears. In the areas where polar bears hunt for food on the sea ice, the ice has been rapidly decreasing. And this is why the IUCN lists polar bears as a vulnerable species and cites sea ice loss from climate change as the single biggest threat to their survival. And of course, it's not just polar bears. Many species on the IUCN Red List are listed as endangered, at least partly partly because of climate change, which might alter their habitat in many different ways. Next, I want to talk about the CO2 fertilizer effect. As I mentioned in the previous video, under lab conditions given ample water and nutrients, plants will exhibit an overall increase in net primary production. That is, they will do more photosynthesis and increase in biomass more. However, it is not clear to what degree this effect can be replicated in ecosystems which have limited supplies of water and limited supplies of nutrients which are required to do more photosynthesis. Not all plants conduct photosynthesis in just the same way either. There are different modes of photosynthesis called the C3 pathway, the C4 pathway, and the CAM pathway. C4 and CAM plants are very well adapted to hot, dry conditions, so you would expect them to get a competitive advantage in a hotter, drier world. However, laboratory experiments have found that C3 plants actually get the greatest benefit from an increased CO2 world. Chances are some of the other negative effects caused by climate change will counteract a lot of the increase in growth that we would normally have seen under lab conditions. But what is most likely is that the competitive landscape will change in several different ways, and in a given ecosystem, certain plants will benefit more than others, and they will grow in abundance while the others decrease in abundance, and that's going to lead to a net decrease in biodiversity. Speaking of organisms that might actually benefit from climate change, some species of insects will do quite well for themselves. For example, bark beetles, a pest which destroys large sections of forest, will actually be able to get 2 breeding seasons in some areas, and they won't have nearly as large die-offs during the winter. And the same goes for many species of mosquitoes. And mosquitoes won't just benefit from local climatic changes. As the temperature rises, their native range is going to expand toward the poles, giving them more space to spread out, and they'll be active for longer sections of the year, and therefore any diseases that they might be carrying, for example malaria or Zika virus, may have increased opportunities for transmission to humans. Across the world, there are over 1,800 amphibian species that are considered threatened. 427 are considered critically endangered, 761 are considered endangered, and 668 are considered vulnerable. Now, this results from a wide variety of causes, including habitat destruction and pollution. It seems that certain pesticides have lowered the frogs' immune systems. In addition, there is a very nasty fungal disease called chytrid fungus, which is affecting many frog populations, including this golden frog from Panama, which is a critically endangered species. In some areas, massive outbreaks of this disease are linked to drought times, and droughts are something that is exacerbated by climate change. In other cases, it has been suggested that the addition of climatic factors as a stressor to these populations that are already endangered by habitat loss and pollution is just the straw that breaks the camel's back. One thing that is certain, though, is that amphibian populations are in decline worldwide. And speaking of species going extinct, let's talk a little bit more about coral reefs. You might be familiar with seeing coral reefs, these very elaborate structures that are homes to fish and mussels and snails and all kinds of different marine organisms. Corals are actually a kind of animal, relatively closely related to a jellyfish. That reef that you see is actually a secretion. They create a calcium carbonate skeleton, and generation by generation they lay down the foundation for this massive habitat that is one of the most biodiverse locations in the world. And these reefs are beautiful, coming in a variety of shapes and colors. Now, the color that coral have is actually a result of a symbiont that they have living inside of them. Corals have a mutualistic relationship with algae. The algae capture solar radiation and create sugars, providing a food source for the coral, and the byproduct of that is oxygen, which animals need to survive, and the corals provide a nice safe location for the algae to live and plenty of nutrient waste, in addition to the carbon dioxide supply from cellular respiration. As global temperatures rise, the water also increases in temperature, and as carbon dioxide content increases in the oceans, they become more acidic. When this occurs, the corals expel the algae which live inside their tissue, and it turns the coral white, which we refer to as coral bleaching. and a collapse of the reef ecosystem is sometimes not too far behind. Losing coral reefs would be both an ecological and an economic disaster. I'd like to leave you with some positive news. So, in the United States, the solar and wind industries have been increasing in market share over the past few years. Simultaneously, we've seen a massive drop-off in the usage of coal over the past few decades, owing at least in part to the increase in use of natural gas, which is at least a cleaner burning fossil fuel. Although obviously not ideal, I'll take any victory I can get. Further improvements will require individuals who are willing to reduce their consumption and who are well informed on these issues and understand that ecological problems have both environmental and economic side effects that, while complicated, should not be ignored. The emission of greenhouse gases in the United States over the past few years has actually begun to slow down and even drop off. With continuous effort, we may be able to delay some of these short-term effects of climate change and potentially even avoid some of the worst ones.